It's been a controversial project from the beginning. Sidewalk Labs wants to develop a big parcel of land on the Toronto waterfront, creating a high-tech, data-driven neighbourhood. Privacy and transparency concerns, costs, and now potentially an issue around taxation and development fees have complicated an already complicated plan. Dan Doctoroff is founder and CEO of Sidewalk Labs. He's a former deputy mayor of New York City, and he joins us now with his perspective on all of this. Thanks for making some time for us.
My pleasure.
I don't want to assume that everybody knows what Sidewalk Labs is, because we've got viewers all over the province of Ontario, not just in the capital city. So let's start there. What does Sidewalk Labs do?
So first of all, Sidewalk Labs is a unit of Alphabet, which is also the parent of Google. We're the much smaller parent subsidiary of Google. And our mission is to improve urban life by combining cutting-edge innovation with great urban design to really address some of the key issues that cities are wrestling with today, like how do we manage to afford to house people in a way that they can actually live? How do we move people around in new ways? How do we actually deal with the issue of climate change by creating truly sustainable communities? How do we create jobs and other economic opportunity where otherwise it might be hard? So that's really what our mission is. And we have partnered with Waterfront Toronto, which in turn is a tripartite agency.
A very confusing agency sometimes, yes?
Well, look, I mean, government can be complicated, and particularly when you have an agency that itself has three governments as its constituents, it's always going to be a little bit challenging and complicated.
Now, your company's a private company, right?
We are.
So you got to make money.
We do. I've said our primary mission is to demonstrate what's possible, truly create the first 21st century district. Yes, we do have to make money.
So how do you make money?
Well, part of the way you make money is through real estate development. And we would develop a small portion of what we call the eastern waterfront, mostly to demonstrate what's possible. We have a whole series of hypotheses in terms of innovation and what it can actually do. We would also probably hope to play a role in financing infrastructure to catalyze the development of an area that has basically been an underperformer, has not fulfilled the dreams and aspirations of many city builders before us for over 100 years. So to some extent play a role in that. And then some of the innovations that we actually develop here, we would hope over time to take to other places around the world.
Can I just understand what you said in terms of contributing to infrastructure? Does that mean you are prepared to pay for some of the costs to mount a light rail transit system in that area?
We're certainly prepared to help ensure that it gets financed. So let me give you a good example of that. One of the reasons that the eastern waterfront has never developed, and literally it's been 107 years since they first started filling it in, is because there's no infrastructure there. One of the key infrastructure things that just hasn't ever gotten done and doesn't appear to be on anybody's near-term radar screen is extending the LRT across Queens Quay and then into this area. Part of the reason there is no realistic probability of it getting done in the short or intermediate or even in the longer term is there's no political constituency for it because nobody lives there.
No, it's very low on the priority list right now.
Exactly. And so the question is, if you really believe that this is an important area that needs to develop, that can actually be done, we think, in a completely new way that addresses some of the issues that Torontonians are struggling with, how do you actually make sure that the infrastructure actually is there to make it happen? And what we're saying is we're prepared to play a role in being a catalyst for that. One of the ideas that we've been discussing amongst ourselves, we really haven't been talking about it externally yet, but a leaked document got out and that became somewhat controversial, was a self-financing mechanism, which is say, if you kind of finance it up front, but you only look to the increase in tax revenues, property tax revenues, or perhaps developer charges that otherwise wouldn't happen but for the investment in infrastructure to pay you back, is that a valid form of financing? It's something that's used in many other
Is
jurisdictions.
that tax increment financing?
It's kind of like tax increment financing. And the key thing about it is that the investors don't get paid back unless there is development. And the development is only made possible by virtue of the investment in infrastructure. And so is that, and that's the question I think that'll be a part of all sorts of public discussion, is that a valid approach when there's no real prospect of getting it financed and putting the infrastructure in place otherwise?
Well, one of the reasons we were happy to accept, we're glad you accepted our invitation to be here today, is that when the Toronto Star did report on that leaked document, it did raise a whole bunch of questions that heretofore had not been raised. And I guess that's one of the things, that's one of the criticisms your organization has come in for, that if this was really part of the plan all the way along, how come we're only hearing about it now?
Because it hasn't been part of the plan all along. What was leaked was an internal document that was a bunch of concepts that we've been recently developing, thinking on. I think we've actually been, to be fair to us, I think we've been actually pretty transparent. You know, over the course of the last year since we entered into the deal with Waterfront Toronto, we've had countless public meetings. We've literally met in person with 18,000 people over the course of a year. We've received thousands and thousands of comments. We've digested those comments. We keep iterating, and it's just more recently that we've actually started to get to the question of, well, how do you actually achieve the objectives here? And let's not lose sight of the objectives. The objectives that Waterfront Toronto, the city, the province, the national government all laid out is, can you find a way to make housing more affordable? Can you find a way to create new ways of getting people around? Can you find a way to think about the environment in a different way? Can you find a way to actually have a community where people at different income levels can live and work together and feel like they're part of a community together? And we think that's possible.
If you think you've consulted so widely and well, why are you coming up for so much criticism from so many who believe that the process has not been adequately transparent?
I think because this is a new idea. It came out in a way that we did not want it to, because we weren't ready yet to talk about it. And I think, that was a little jarring for people. But I think we have demonstrated over the course of the last year that we listen. Look, we're big believers that in order to create a successful project, particularly one that is new and different, you have to put ideas out there. You have to be willing to take the criticism. You don't cut and run like some other big technology companies might.
Now, what could that be a reference to?
I can't imagine.
What would the former deputy mayor of New York City be referring to there? So you're not going to be Amazon. You're not cutting and running.
No, we believe in that kind of constructive dialogue, and we believe the criticism makes us better. When I was deputy mayor of New York in the Bloomberg administration, we did 140 separate rezonings, replannings of neighborhoods in New York. And of those 140, we got 139 of them passed. And in every single one of them, the process of listening, reflecting, revising, consulting made our plans better. We're big believers in that. And so we expect to get criticized.
Okay, let me share some more criticism with
Sure.
you then. Here's the Toronto Star reporting a quote from one of the councillors in the area that includes the Portlands. The councillor says, the revelations left me very highly disturbed because all along the understanding was that this project was for a smart city for the 12 acres, and it's very clear that they want to control the destiny of the Portlands, and that's never been in any kind of agreement. Does this person have a point in as much as what is emerging now is new and had not been discussed with the politicians before?
With all due respect, I think that's not accurate. And let me cite some facts. Okay, the first is the request for proposals that Waterfront Toronto issued that we responded to 20 times in that RFP. noted that respondents should actually consider the issue of scale, going beyond the 12 acres. In our response, dozens and dozens of times we talked about the importance of scale. Let me give you an example. If you think that autonomous vehicles might be an answer to some of the transportation woes that we have here over time, and you believe that this could be an interesting opportunity to experiment with the impact of self-driving cars, it's never been realistic to assume that you could do that on 12 acres. If you believe that wood buildings, which is something we're interested in, can actually be part of the answer to lowering the cost of housing so we can actually have mixed income communities in this city. We believe that at scale, you can lower the cost of housing by 20% or so by factory produced but incredibly creatively designed buildings. You can't build a factory and get to the scale to reduce those costs on 12 acres. And everyone's always known that. Our agreement with Waterfront Toronto acknowledged that scale was going to be important, not that we had to own it. We're not suggesting that we should own it. And by the way, the city council report on this acknowledged that scale was actually important. So that's not a big surprise in reality.
So the politicians who are expressing criticism and shock at the latest revelations are doing what?
I think in part because a lot of the focus in terms of planning thus far has been on Quayside, probably forgetting that scale actually does matter. But to be clear, we are not suggesting that we should develop any more than a tiny fraction of this. What we do think is that it's important to consider scale in order to achieve the lofty aspirations that everybody agrees should be applied to this place.
Do you need the new Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, and his government to approve this?
For certain parts of it, absolutely. We'll need all three levels of government in part, as well as the Waterfront Toronto Board.
You saw the Globe and Mail reported that Premier Ford has apparently had a conversation with somebody saying that he won't approve it. Do you know about this?
Well, I certainly saw the article, but we welcome the dialogue. And at the end of the day, if people don't want to do this, we accept that. Okay, this is not about us. At the end of the day, the people of Toronto, the people of Ontario, the people of Canada have to believe that this is worth it. If they believe that creating what we think could be over 100,000 jobs is worth it, then hopefully we'll be able to get enough people to agree. If they believe that creating the first truly climate positive community in the world is worth it, we'll agree. If they believe, as we think is possible, you can get up to 40% of the units in the first phase of this Quayside to be below market or affordable, then people will hopefully agree to go ahead with this. But if they don't, we understand that. Look, the last thing we ever want to do is impose our will on a place that doesn't want something. It doesn't work that way. And look, I have enough experience in government in New York to recognize that everything has to be a process of compromise in order to get to a place that everyone feels comfortable.
Can this plan work if you don't get the kind of creative tax financing that you described earlier?
There may be other approaches, but again, to be clear, all we're talking about is financing it. It could be others financing it, doesn't have to be us. We just want to see that it actually happens. And I think everyone should want that too, because in fact, there was just a report released, I think, 2 weeks ago by the Waterfront Business Improvement Association, which said that if, as it looks like right now, the LRT is not developed until 2045, the city loses $20 billion in lost economic output. So whether it's us or it's someone else, there has to be a way of finding, and it's going to have to be a creative way, given the politics, of finding the infrastructure to make that place turn into something that's more than a storage facility.
We have, Mr. Doctoroff, we've done a few shows on this subject because it is very new and very interesting proposal with its share of criticism, which makes it a great story. I guess one of the areas that has proved to be most controversial is what are you going to do with the data that you're going to collect? And to that end, I want to just play you a clip here from Ann Cavoukian, whom I know you know. She was an advisor on this project, former Information and Privacy Commissioner in the province of Ontario for, I think, 15 years. This really is her bag, and she stopped being an advisor to this project, and here's why. Sheldon, the clip, please.
They created this new group called the Civic Data Trust, which sounds great, to address the governance issues associated with this. There's privacy issues and governance issues. They're both very important. I address privacy. And they said the Civic Data Trust will consist of Waterfront Toronto, ourselves, other bodies, companies, and others, and we will encourage them to de-identify the data at source, but we have no control over what they do.
So encouragement wasn't enough.
Oh my God. This must happen as the default.
De-identifying data at source. That's what she wants. She obviously doesn't feel that you have made an adequate commitment to that, which is why she left. What's the latest?
Well, first of all, I think the important distinction to understand is, A, we said we will do that. But secondly, we said we're proposing the creation of a body that will control all of the urban data. And all we said was it really ought to be up to them to decide what their own principles and policies are, rather than being presumptuous in determining what those policies are. We also suggested, by the way, that incorporating Ann's ideas of privacy by design into the policies of the Urban Data Trust or Civic Data Trust is a good idea. So to be honest, I think her criticism wasn't really very fair because fundamentally we're in alliance with her. We generally agree. We think she's made a great contribution to the practice of privacy, not just here, but around the world. And we relied very heavily on her ideas. We just didn't feel we could impose them on an entity that we are merely suggesting get created. The key thing not to lose sight of is that everybody thought that our business model was to hoover up all sorts of data and exploit it and sell advertising off of it, and I think people were shocked when we said, hey, wait a minute, we're going to take a very different approach than people would expect of us. We believe that urban data collected in the physical environment or in semi-public spaces, is actually a public asset that ought to be controlled by an independent public entity. We ought to be subject to the same rules as everybody else. We don't want to control it. We don't want to sell it. That, I think, is the big point here. And it's part of the reason why you actually have heard a lot less about privacy and data over the last several months since we released that proposal. And I also want to point out, I think the whole question of privacy and data is actually kind of instrumental. We took a lot of heat over privacy and data before we ever announced a policy, because what we said at the very beginning of this process is that we were going to listen to people, we were going to get lots of opinions, we were going to think about them, we were going to put them out for comment, we were going to think about them some more, reflect on them, try and explain what we were doing. And we did that. And we did that with privacy and data, and we're prepared to do that with all aspects of this, because again, we don't believe in imposing anything. We believe in hopefully bringing creative ideas to unlock very difficult problems.
Well, since you seem to be so open to constructive criticism, we have some more for you.
I'm surprised.
Here's Jim Balsillie, who's the former co-CEO of Research in Motion. He actually had a letter in the newspaper just yesterday, and he was on this program earlier this month, and he had this to say. Sheldon, please.
When you deal with these kinds of issues, they're very technical. And it requires expertise, and you must be very deliberate and systemic. So the people who made this decision have no expertise whatsoever on these IP and data issues. So it would be like me walking into a neurosurgery operating clinic and say, can I have a turn? So we have a rogue agency with no expertise operating outside of its government prescribed mandates. And this tail is wagging the dog of the digital nervous system of the whole country.
That's Waterfront Toronto he's talking about there, and who are your partners in this venture. What do you say to his characterization of this?
I think, first of all, it shows incredible disrespect to a lot of really hardworking, very competent public servants. I think also what you can see out of government is very capable of bringing people in and gaining expertise. No one ever expects people to have all the expertise they need when an issue comes up. In fact, Waterfront Toronto did that. They created a digital strategy advisory panel. To be honest, we had issues with them originally, but as we've actually over the last several months been working through issues in much greater detail, we've basically been able to really understand each other in a level of depth that I don't think people would have assumed even a few months ago. So I'm as a former government official, I often resent when people from the private sector come in and say, oh, they're from government, therefore they must not actually be able to think through a problem or come up with a great solution, because people can listen to people, they can gain expertise, and I think we ought to have a higher degree of confidence in our public servants.
In our remaining moments here, let me circle back to something that you said earlier. You said, if Toronto wants us, we'll come here and we'll do this, and if Toronto doesn't want us, at the end of the day, we won't. How will you gauge whether you have adequate support to go forward with this?
Well, at the end of the day, I think that there'll need to be votes in the City Council. There will need to be approvals at the provincial level. There'll need to probably be some approvals at the federal level, and clearly we'll need to have the support of the Waterfront Toronto Board. At any one of those steps, we could be unsuccessful.
So you got to run the table for this to happen. You can't really have no one of those groups can be offside for this to happen.
No, but they don't have to all weigh in on every aspect of everything. There are different responsibilities and roles for the different levels of government. But what we have seen thus far is, at least among the Torontonians who know about this project and have a point of view, that overwhelmingly they're excited about the possibility.
How do you know that?
Because we've actually seen polling that actually shows that. So they're excited about the possibility of having 40% affordable housing. They are excited about the possibility of creating tens, if not over 100,000 jobs in this place. They're excited about making Toronto the global hub for urban innovation, a potential huge industry that this city, this province can actually dominate. Let me give you an example of sort of what gets people excited. As I mentioned, we think wood buildings, mass timber buildings, are going to be the staple of the building stock, both residential and commercial, on Quayside, and then to see beyond. That industry is one that is just starting to come to fruition. If you take this laboratory of urban innovation, supported by an alphabet company that's prepared to invest a lot of money, and if we can prove our hypotheses that we can actually lower cost of housing and other construction significantly to make a place more affordable, that's going to be seen by the entire world. And by the way, that is not just an industry that affects these 12 acres or more on the waterfront. Think about the timber producers in Northern Ontario. Think about the loggers. Think about the truckers. Think about the carpenters. There's a whole ecosystem of jobs that can actually be created right here. And then think about that industry going global, taking an incredible natural resource of this province and this country and turning it into a job-creating engine. That's why people actually can potentially get excited. Our job is to show how that's possible.
In our last 20 seconds here, the political nerd in me wants to ask you a question about whether your old boss, Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor, is going to run for president. What do you think?
I think it would be great if he did. I think Mike Bloomberg is, one of the most competent human beings in the world. I don't know whether he will. I'm not sure he knows
You
yet.
know whether Americans have had enough of billionaire presidents from New York?
That'd
be the only thing they have in common, incidentally. But
That's
yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Look, I think Mike is a remarkable guy who would bring fresh ideas and a really different approach to managing government. Whether he wants to do it, only he knows at this point.
Gotcha. That's Dan Doctoroff. He's the CEO of Sidewalk Labs, and we thank you for making some time for us at TVO tonight.
My pleasure.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.